All right, so last week we talked about taxes, in other words, the revenue side of what government does with money. This week the topic is the expenditure side, and you know, like everything else we do in this class, we have to be pretty selective about what we talk about. So I want to talk about specifically about welfare policy. And let me begin by suggesting to you that the way I use that term welfare may be different than the way that you understand the term welfare. In my experience, a lot of people seem to have an understanding of the concept of welfare that's a little bit different than mine. So I'll tell you what I think most people are thinking about when they hear the word welfare or use the word welfare, and then I'll tell you what I mean by it. What I think most people are thinking of is, or what we might call public assistance program. What I would more accurately use the term public assistance programs, poverty relief programs, right? Programs that are designed to help people who are below the poverty threshold, have a greater ability to meet the basic needs, et cetera. I could be wrong about that. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but my experience has been over many, many years that that's the way most of my students understand the word welfare, at least when we begin talking about welfare policy. On the other hand, I think about welfare as a broader concept. Okay? Welfare policy or welfare policies are those that redistribute. Okay? They have a redistributive effect. So consequently, that includes public assistance programs, poverty relief programs, but it also includes a number of other programs that most people probably don't want to think about as welfare. Right? What do I mean by redistributive? Any thoughts there? What that term might mean? What is redistributive? It has a redistributive effect. Well, if I talk about redistributing income, to be a little bit more precise, or redistributing wealth more broadly, these are policies or these are programs that take wealth from one segment of society and move it to another segment of society. So clearly poverty relief programs do that, right? But what I'm saying is that there are programs that have redistributive effects that aren't targeted at the poor population. There are redistributive programs, at least some, that we could argue redistribute wealth from the poor segments of the lower end of the income scale to the upper end of the income scale. For example, last week we talked about the concept of regressive taxes. Right? We didn't really talk about the effects of regressive taxes in this sense, but most economists will tell you that the effect of regressive taxation, of a tax structure that is regressive in nature, is to redistribute wealth from the lower end of the income scale to the upper end of the income scale. So you can have redistribution in both directions. You can have programs that redistribute to middle income. Okay? Consider, for example, public elementary and secondary education. I would argue that public elementary and secondary education has redistributive effects. By the same token, just let me throw this in as well, higher education, public colleges and universities have redistributive effects. And I think, by the way, that. You have some intuition about that because, after all, I think that's, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm willing to bet a small amount of money. That's why you're here getting a college education. Is because you have some sense that you're going to have a better life later on as a result of getting more education. You can get a better paying job, you have more income, etc. Well, you may be thinking, well, so what? I'm paying for my education. I'm paying my tuition and fees, right? Just a quick show of hands. How many of you believe that the tuition and fee, when you register for classes at the beginning of the spring semester, there was some dollar amount, bottom line dollar amount that you paid to Wharton County Junior College to cover tuition and fees, right? How many of you believe that that covers the full cost of providing you the education? Nobody believes that? Well, you're all right, okay, because it doesn't cover the full cost. In fact, it covers only a small fraction of the cost. Who's picking up the rest of the financial stroke? Well, the taxpayers are, right? So that's the whole philosophy of community colleges, by the way, okay, and more generally public universities, because the idea is that society as a whole is better off if you get an education. And so taxpayers are willing to pay some of that bill in order to help you get your education. Well, I don't want to drift too far from the main point. My point is simply that it's redistributive in nature. But the same thing can be said of public elementary and secondary education, right? It redistributes. A program like Social Security is redistributive in nature, right? Who does it redistribute from? People who are earning a wage right now, and redistribute it to people who are not earning a wage right now, Social Security recipients. And we can get into a little bit of detail of what that means exactly. But you understand the point that I'm making. Nobody wants to call Social Security a welfare program, right? They don't want to think about it as, because it's not a poverty relief program, but they don't want to think about it as welfare, perhaps because there's some pejorative associations with that term welfare, right? So again, maybe we can get into that a little bit. But all I'm telling you is that there's no question that it has redistributive effects. So really anything that has redistributive effects, I'm calling welfare. What most people seem to be thinking of, as far as I can tell, is programs specifically that are aimed at helping the poor. And I'm just saying that's too narrow for our purposes. We need the broader understanding. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to suggest to you that in this country, in the United States, which of course Texas is a part of, we have had two main approaches to doing public welfare programs, okay? A universal approach and a selective approach. So what do I mean by, or it's not my term, I don't know the origins of these two terms, who originated them, but certainly, people who study welfare policy, and that would include not only political scientists and policy analysts, but sociologists, for example, as well, typically use these two terms, welfare universalism and welfare selectivism. So what do they mean by welfare universalism? Well, universalism is an approach to doing public welfare where the simplest way I can describe it to you is that you have a population that is receiving benefits and everyone in that population receives benefits. Right? That there's no attempt to sort out, maybe based on an income threshold or something like that, who's eligible for benefits. Does that make sense? Selectivism, on the other hand, there is an income threshold. These are what we call means testing. On there on the right-hand side where it says selectivism, maybe this is a term you've heard before. Anybody ever heard this term before? Anybody here taking a sociology course or another course or some other context, maybe not even in your formal education, but you've just come across this term before, means tested? Want to take a guess at what it suggests? I kind of told you a moment ago without connecting means tested to it. It's just the idea that there's some threshold, there's some income threshold, so that if you fall below the income threshold, maybe the federal poverty line, right, you're eligible for benefits, all other things being the same. If you're above the income threshold, then you're not eligible. That's the basic idea behind the means test. Okay? So we have some programs in this country where a means test is applied and others where a means test is not applied. So what's the difference between the two? Well, let me give you some examples. Over here, I've already mentioned public education. There's not a means test applied to public education. Here I was thinking when I wrote this bullet point, I was thinking probably exclusively of public elementary and secondary education. But I think it also applies to higher education as well. Given what I just told you about the taxpayers paying a large chunk of the bill when it comes to your college education, right? There's no means test. Nobody asks you, in order to enroll in college, nobody asks you how much money you make. That might be an issue if you're getting financial aid. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, just to enroll, there's not a means test. So public elementary and secondary education, but also public colleges and universities would be examples of welfare universalism. I mentioned a moment ago, well, I forgot this one was in there, so let me deal with that one first. Veterans benefits. So this might include a number of specific policies or programs, but I guess one example that I might use to illustrate that is if you have a veteran who wants to buy a house, okay, they can choose to get a VA loan, okay, as opposed to a conventional loan. Okay? It doesn't matter what their income is. There's no income means test imposed on that, right? Veterans are entitled by statute to that benefit, okay? But how is that going to differ from the rest of the people who are in the housing market trying to buy homes? What's the difference between a VA loan and a conventional loan as the most obvious thing that we can point to? Well, it's going to mean a lower mortgage rate. So in a sense, government is subsidizing the mortgages that veterans take out if they avail themselves of this benefit. But there's no means test applied. It could be a very wealthy veteran. It could be a very destitute veteran, or relatively poor veteran. Right? Here's the example that I started to say, and I'd forgotten veterans benefits was in there, but so what most people call Social Security. The more formal name of the program is Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance, OASDI. And there are three main target populations. Old age, meaning people of retirement age, okay, the elderly. Survivors. Who are survivors? What sort of characteristics are we talking about? We're talking about a population called survivors. Well, who else besides the elderly are you aware of? Anybody else that might be eligible to receive Social Security benefits? They're not retired. So if you have, let's say, a family where the primary income earner is deceased, the children, the dependents, or maybe the spouse as well, would be eligible to receive Social Security benefits. That's what we mean by survivors, or what this program is referring to with the term survivors. And then the disabled, that's probably pretty straightforward, right? The physically and mentally disabled are also eligible to receive benefits under Social Security. But let's face it, most of the time when people think about Social Security, they're thinking about retirement people, okay? So what I'm suggesting to you, and kind of hinted at a few minutes ago with Social Security, is that Social Security is a program which taxes people who are earning a wage right now and redistributes that money to people who are not earning a wage right now, the elderly. But there's no income threshold. There's no means test that's applied. Although I will say that, in recent decades, there have been some who have been bold enough in the political arena out there, been bold enough to suggest that a means test ought to be applied to Social Security, but that never gets anywhere because people look at this program differently. I said a few minutes ago that people don't want to think about Social Security as welfare. People who have that association that welfare means poverty relief, right? It's a public assistance. Welfare is synonymous with public assistance for a lot of people, right? So clearly, a lot of people don't want to think about Social Security that way, right? Why not? I'm just really trying to get your thoughts on, sort of the psychology of these programs. Why wouldn't most people want to think about Social Security as a welfare program if they understand welfare to mean, poverty relief? Well, probably because they know they're going to be on Social Security someday, and they don't want to think about themselves as being on the dole, right? They don't want to think about themselves as being impoverished and therefore in need of help from the government. Most people want to think about Social Security as a program that they pay into and they get out of it what they paid into it. But it doesn't work that way. It never has worked that way since its inception in 1935. People who are getting Social Security benefits, retirees, who are getting Social Security benefits have always gotten more out of the system than they paid into it. It's always been a redistributed program. Does that make sense? Here's the companion program. So notice that Medicare, most people call Medicare, is actually old age survivors and disability health insurance. So it's exactly the same target populations. And again, there's not a means test that's applied. So this is a universal approach. What's the distinction between universal and welfare selectivism? Well, the easiest way, again, just to reinforce that idea that we started with, the easiest way to make that distinction is to say, is there a means test applied? So there's no means test applied to Medicare. Here are some examples of programs that would fall into the other category, welfare selectivism, where there is a means test applied. So a number of programs that we would consider to be public assistance programs. Here's one that I bet you've heard of before, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, as it's often called. Used to be called food stamps. Is there a means test applied to food stamps? Yeah, right? You have to fall below an income threshold in order to be eligible to receive benefits. By the way, food stamps was a program that was created back in the 1960s. And interestingly, it was originally viewed as a program to support farmers because it meant that the farm income would be stabilized as new consumers were able to buy products that were produced by farmers. We don't really think about it too much in those terms anymore, but that's the origins of it, food stamps. So it's a program that's administered, or that was created to fall under the administration of the Department of Agriculture back in the 1960s. Still is, I think, administered at the federal level by the Department of Agriculture. Here's a program that goes back to 1935. In fact, this program was created by the same legislation that created the Social Security program. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a program originally called Aid to Dependent Children, and then became known as Aid to Families with Dependent Children. But now, today, for about the last 20 or so years, it's been, in most states, referred to as Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. What's the target population of this program? Does anybody know? Who are we talking about? Yes, it's kind of right there in the name, but can you be a little bit more specific? Who said families? Okay, yeah, I thought that was you. Can you be a little bit more specific about, like, which families?
Families that are single mothers.
That's what I was trying to get you to nail down for us, because it is it's not exclusively single parent, female-headed households, but it's mainly single mothers and their children. Okay? And really, that's been a characteristic feature of Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and now called TANF. Okay, but the other thing that we have to remember here is that there's an income threshold. There's a means test that's applied. So, you have to fall below a certain income level in order to receive benefits. Okay, good. How about this one, Medicaid? Medicaid, that's different. A lot of times people get these two confused, Medicare and Medicaid. Okay, so maybe one way to just easily distinguish between the two in your mind, so that you know which program you're reading about in the news story, or that you're hearing about in the news story. Medicare does not have a means test applied. Medicaid does. So we're talking about the poor. We're talking about a program that provides medical benefits to the poor, or access to health care for the poor. And we're talking in large part about overlapping, populations here with all three of these. Look, here's the deal. In most states, and certainly this is true in Texas, if you're eligible to receive TANF benefits, you're also eligible to receive SNAP benefits, and you're also eligible to receive Medicaid benefits. Although it might shock you how many families who are on TANF do not avail themselves, for whatever reason, of SNAP benefits or Medicaid. It's like a really high percentage of people. I had a student in the class last semester, we were talking about this. She told me that her mother worked for the agency in Texas that administers these programs, and that she said her mother told her, you can do with this information whatever you want to do with it, because it is what they would call in courts of law hearsay, right? She told me that her mother told her that as a staff member at that agency, that they do not inform, like when a mother walks in and applies for TANF benefits, they do not inform them that they're also eligible for SNAP and also eligible for Medicaid, that they kind of have to find out that information on their own. So that may be a big part of the explanation why there's such a high percentage that receive TANF benefits that don't receive either food stamps or Medicaid, because it presupposes a knowledge, or at least the ability to get at the information that where they would know that they're automatically eligible. They don't automatically get the benefits, but they're eligible. Supplemental security income. That's the same target population that we have up here with OASDI, but it's supplemental. It's in addition to, and there's a means test applied, right? So in other words, if the individual falls below an income level, an income threshold, they might also be entitled to receive supplemental security income benefits, assuming that they would otherwise be eligible to receive Social Security. Here's one that some of you may have heard of, CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Program. And you're going to have to ask somebody who has a lot more detailed understanding of these programs than I do, why there would be a separate program called CHIP from Medicaid, but it is the case, for example, in Texas, that a parent might enroll their child in the CHIP program, but not be enrolled in the Medicaid program. Okay, so we've got 4 examples over here of welfare universalism, and half dozen examples over here of selectivism. And this is certainly not full comprehensive lists of either approach, but it's enough to make the point, which is that for the most part, we use a selective approach in the United States. When we're talking about welfare policy, and particularly when we're talking about public assistance programs, we're mainly talking about this approach, selective approach, which raises some interesting questions that I want to get to here in today's class, okay? But let me just very quickly, there was another one on there, housing assistance, okay? Public housing, Section 8 housing, that kind of thing, right? Income threshold or a means test applied. Okay, so let me suggest a number of characteristics associated with each approach. For the most part, programs that we would characterize as following this universal approach, they tend to be designed and implemented at the national level. And there's a relatively uniform level of benefits. Here are some of the characteristics of welfare selectivism. I've already established one of them, but there's several others here. These are programs that are generally characterized as national and state partnerships. So for example, when the Social Security Act of 1935 was passed by Congress, when was that passed? 1935, right? When Congress passed that legislation that we call the Social Security Act, it created 2 programs, well, a number of programs, but the 2 we're talking about are Social Security, OASDI, and by the way, Medicare didn't come along until the 1960s, okay? So it established Social Security, OASDI, and aid to dependent children, which became shortly after that known as aid to families with dependent children. Social Security was established as a program that was designed and implemented at the national level by the Social Security Administration. Aid to families with dependent children was designed as a national state partnership where the national role was limited primarily to providing matching funds. So each of these programs that we're talking about, AFDC, food stamps, Medicaid, and any of these others that fall under this heading of selectivism, were typically set up as national state partnerships where the role of the national government as a partner was principally a financial role to provide matching funds. And that match may be as little as, say, 50-50. 50% of the funds come from the national government, 50% of the funds come from the state governments. But in many cases, it might have been as high as 70, 75% or something like that. Okay? 70, like a 70-30. The states come up with 30% of the funds, and the national government's going to come up with 70% of the funds. And typically, they were set up, to go back to a term that we dealt with earlier in the semester, although it was during that week of the semester where classes were canceled and I had to provide some video material for you. The topic that week was the week on federalism, and you had to go out and view some videos that I put out there for you. But even if you don't remember that, or maybe you didn't do that at the time, we had a chapter in the textbook on federalism, and the authors of your textbook talk about these. What are the features of the federal system in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, are what they call these grants and aid programs. Categorical grants being one type of grant and aid program, block grants being another type. Is this ringing a bell for anyone? You remember that? Has it been too long ago? Like week 5 or week 6 of the semester or something like that. So it was a while back. Anyway, if it does ring a bell for you, great. If it doesn't, maybe go back. You got to study for the final exam anyway. Maybe go back and review that portion in the textbook. Most of these programs, like aid to families with dependent children in the 1930s, food stamps in the 1960s, Medicaid in the 1960s, CHIP more recently, I think the 1980s, right? These were set up as categorical grant programs initially, where the federal government gave money to the states for the purposes of implementing this specific program, AFDC, or this specific program, food stamps, or this specific program, Medicaid, right? Now, in the 1990s, some of that changed because some of that money went from categorical grants into block grants, where the federal government began providing money to the states in the form of a block grant for public assistance programs. Okay, but that's kind of a fine point. You don't need to really worry about that. The broader point that I'm trying to make to you is that this is really the extent of the federal government's role. To a very great extent, this is pretty much the limits of the national government's role in these programs. There was also some effort to make sure that the states did not administer these programs in a discriminatory manner. I'm talking about on the basis of race or ethnicity, that they're not going to provide benefits to people who would otherwise be eligible for benefits for some like racial or ethnic reasons. But beyond that, these programs were pretty much left to the states to design and implement. So what does that mean? Among a lot of things that we could touch on, I'm just going to touch on 3 things here. It meant that the states determined eligibility standards. Unlike, say, Social Security, that's designed and implemented at the national level, and where there is no income threshold, determining eligibility does not vary from state to state. But determining eligibility with TANF or with SNAP, that does vary from state to state. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. You can take a family, say a mother and 2 children, who would be eligible to receive TANF benefits in a state like, say, maybe Minnesota. I'm just picking some things arbitrarily here, but imagine a family that's receiving benefits in Minnesota under TA&F. You move them to Texas, everything else the same, and they might not be eligible for benefits. Or Alabama. That's really the first point that I'm trying to make. And the question of whether you're eligible or not, before we get to these other two here, these are largely irrelevant if the state determines that you're not eligible. So that's the first point I want you to understand about these programs, is that there's not a national standard for determining who's eligible and who's not eligible. It's something that is to a large extent left to the states to decide. The second element of the programs involves setting the need standards. So I want you to think about kind of like what the bureaucrats who are administering this program have to do to determine the need standards. So they kind of develop a list of things, of recurring needs, right? Basic needs that the family has to have. What do you think might go on that list? I'm not asking you to give me a dollar amount. I'm asking you to tell me, like, what are some of the basic things that a mother might need to provide for her children if we're talking about a program like TA&F? I'll get you started. Shelter, a place to live, right? What else? Food, clothing. You have to pay for transportation costs, if nothing else, gas to get them back. You're going to have to buy a car perhaps, or obtain a car somehow, right? So I'm just asking you to entertain. I'm not going to give you the comprehensive list here. I don't even have it. But I'm just trying to tell you that the state bureaucracy has to make some determinations about what are basic needs. And then what's the second step? To determine a dollar amount associated with each of those needs. And then the third step is to total that up. And so that's typically what we look at, when we're talking about things like this in a course like this, or, policy analysts or something. They want to look at ultimately the dollar amount. Like, what does Texas say it takes to meet these basic needs? What does Florida say it takes to meet these basic needs? What does Minnesota say that it takes to meet these basic needs? The list is not going to be identical from one state to another. You can bet there are going to be some commonalities, but the final dollar amount's not going to be the same. Absolutely. So we can look at some of that data here in just a second, okay? And then the third element of the program that seems most relevant for our discussion is the level of benefits. What I'm trying to get you to understand here is that there are no states in this country with these programs that we're talking about, TA&F, Medicaid, food stamps, or SNAP, that are actually going to provide a level of benefits consistent with what they determine the need standard to be. And then a very significant effort is paid in most states to preventing fraud, establishing anti-fraud measures. Because there's there has been historically a widespread perception when we talk about these poverty relief programs that they're highly susceptible to fraud, people cheating the system. Even though there's not a whole lot of data to support that fraud is a widespread concern. Poverty relief programs are, I think, one area of public policy where perception is more important than the reality. And the perception has been for a long, long time in this country that these programs are rife with fraud. You didn't hear me say that there's no fraud. There clearly is fraud to some degree that we see in these programs, but I don't think it is at the level that the public generally perceives it to be. The data just doesn't support that. Okay, so one of the questions that I'd like for you to think about here, maybe someone would give us an answer to this question, is why were these programs that we're talking about that follow the selective approach, why were they typically set up to be designed and administered at the state level, whereas the programs that we're talking about that follow the selective approach typically set up to be designed and implemented at the national level? What's the difference between the two? Any thoughts there? Why would we have decided as a society through our elected leadership? Because look, I want you to appreciate what I'm telling you here is that, again, let me go back to Social Security and AFDC. Remember, I told you that those two programs were authorized by the same legislation passed by Congress in 1935. The Social Security Act in 1935 set up, authorized, I should say, both OASDI and what was then called Aid to Dependent Children. Later, that was added, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and now has become, in most states, TANF. So the same law that was passed by Congress in 1935 set this program up as a nationally designed and administered program, and this as a state designed and implemented program. I wonder why. Any thoughts there? What do you think the people, try to put yourself in the position of somebody who's making the argument, right? These programs ought to be designed and administered at the state because what? Any thoughts there? Why would anyone possibly argue that TANF is a program that ought to be at the discretion of the states to determine these things? No thoughts there at all? Well, the main argument that historically you've heard going back to the 1930s, when this debate is engaged, is that the states ought to run these programs because the conditions vary from state to state. The cost of living, for example, is different from state to state. That makes sense? The states ought to determine. Texas knows the conditions in Texas, right? California knows the conditions in California. New York knows the, right? That's the kind of logic. So because the cost of living varies from state to state, these decisions, these determinations ought to be made at the state level. You buy that? A lot of people seem to. But I do have a question, sort of as a follow-up. If it's valid to argue that the cost of living varies from state to state for single mothers and children, is it not also valid to argue that the cost of living varies from state to state for retired people? Or is it just uniform? Is the cost of living uniform, regardless of whether they're in Texas, the retired people are in Texas or Florida or California or Minnesota or wherever? Surely the cost of living varies from state to state for retired people as well, right? So why isn't it valid then for the states to design and run Social Security? Do you understand what I'm asking? There seems to be something different about the way that people perceive these selective programs. That even though people seem to be saying, well, the cost of living varies from state to state, and that's why the states ought to control it, there's really something else at work. There's some sort of judgment being made that it's more proper for the states to run these programs. Now, if you were to go back and do some research, you got a wild hair and decided you wanted to do some reading on it, or maybe you take a class when you transfer to the University of Houston and your assignment is to, do some research on these issues. And you go back and you look at the legislative record when Social Security was being debated in Congress, when that legislation that was passed in 1935 was being debated. Originally, Congress had established that age-dependent children, then later to become aid to families with dependent children, now TANF, and originally that program was going to be administered by a federal agency, just like Social Security was going to be administered. But members of Congress, particularly in the United States Senate, and particularly from southern states, threatened to defeat the bill if the aid to dependent children program was not put under state control. I wonder why they would have been so insistent that this program, and then later programs like food stamps and Medicaid and so on, be under state control rather than federal control. Well, there's a lot of evidence in the congressional record, arguments that were made in the United States Senate, for example, where Southern senators believed that it would upset the racial balance in the South. And remember what Daniel Ellsar told us. We were talking earlier in the semester about Ellsar's classification scheme of culture. Remember the old moralistic, individualistic, and traditionalistic distinctions that we attribute to Daniel Ellsar, where he says that the predominant culture type in the South is traditionalistic. Does anybody remember what the defining characteristic of traditionalism is? In what sense have Southerners been traditional? Well, Ellsar explains it in terms of maintaining the existing order, right? Maintaining the existing social, economic, and political order. Keeping people of wealth and status wealthy in status, having status. Keeping people who don't have wealth and status, keeping them without that status. That's the way Ellsar explains traditionalism. Okay? And he also tells us, if you can remember that far back, because this was really early in the semester, like week 3 or 2 or 3, something like that. Okay? Ellsar also predicts that Southern states are probably going to fund public assistance programs at a bare minimum. Right? They're just not going to pour a lot of money into these programs, and they're also going to design them in a way that's very restrictive. Because in the South, in a place like Texas, for example, we have some very definitive ideas about how you help people who are poor. And one of the things that seems to historically have been present, one idea that seems to historically have been very present in places like Texas and elsewhere in the South is you don't help poor people by giving them too much money or making it too easy for them to get benefits. So yeah, Ellsar would say, yeah, we should expect that the eligibility standards are going to be more strict in Southern states than they are in other parts of the country. And we should expect that the levels of benefits are going to be more strict. So let's see if there's any evidence to support that. So this first little bit of information I have, I think it's just, an initial way of checking that. Notice that Texas ranks at the bottom in a comparison of all 50 states, typically ranks at the bottom in terms of these programs. So particularly, for example, here it says TANF benefit, temporary assistance to needy families benefit, average monthly payment for a family of 3. So we're talking about usually a mother and 2 children, okay? 48 out of 50 states. And that payment is, I forgot when this data is from, but only $156. Here's some other data that I think you might find interesting. Okay, here's a table that shows each state and the percentage of the federal poverty level that it pays with TANF. So somebody who's got eagle eye, tell us which state pays the highest percentage. Anybody see the state that pays the highest? I'm looking at a state here that I think might be the one. Is New York? Can anybody? New York is 48.5%. Does anybody see a number higher than 48.5%? Okay, so what does that number mean? 48.5%. It means that the state of New York has decided with TA&F that it is only going to pay a level of benefits that is about half, a little less than half of the federal poverty level. But then you just go down from there, right? Look at Texas. Texas determines for Texas what the level of benefits is going to be with TA&F. What is the number? I'm not looking at the screen. So a little less than 17%. Texas is saying if you're going to get AFDC or TA&F benefits in this state, you're only going to get about 17% of the federal poverty level. In fact, in every state, if you receive TA&F benefits, you're still poor, as defined by the federal poverty level. But the more interesting question, I think, is why does it range to the extent that it ranges from state to state? A high of 48.5% in New York to a low of, well, Texas is going to be one of the lowest. I don't think it's the lowest, but down around 17%, 16.7%. Oh, there's a look at South Carolina. Is that what it is? 13%? Or is that? Yeah, South Carolina is 13%. Are there any others that are lower than that? Alabama is 13.2%. Where's Mississippi, you said? Oh, there it is up at the top. Oh, yeah, look at that. That's the lowest, right? 10%. In Mississippi, it's only going to be 10% of the federal poverty level. That's the part of it. Maybe it's not to you, okay? You have to decide what's interesting for yourself. But to me, I find that incredibly fascinating. What's behind that? Whereas states like Mississippi and Alabama and Texas are going to pay less than 17%, but a state like New York is going to pay almost half of the federal poverty level. It's an interesting question for you to mull over a little bit. I think that we at least have to take LSR's observations into account. I'm not arguing that culture causes it, but I think attitudes vary from state to state, and we should expect the level of benefits to vary from state to state as well. By the way, remember what I said about the whole question of eligibility. The eligibility standards are different in New York and Texas. And that's really the first consideration. Am I even eligible to receive benefits? Maybe you are in maybe you are in New York, maybe you're not in Texas. Here's a graphic that has this data, I think, is from about 2013. Yeah, there it is right there, 2013. It really hasn't changed that much. There's, I think, one state in here that's probably changed a lot. Tennessee, I think, has gone from about 11% back in 2013 to a couple of years ago. I think they increased it to about 30-something% of the federal poverty level, but so still less than a third, about a third. Right? This data from 2019, 3 years ago, shows the budgetary allowance for a family of three, again, a mother and 2 children. State of Texas says, and including caretaker expenses, that's the mother's expenses, that it takes $751, but again, is only going to provide $188 with a maximum benefit of $303 in state law. That's the cap in state law. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Here is a map that I pulled out of a study by the Center on Budget and Budget and Policy Priorities, publication called "States Must Continue Recent Momentum to Further Improve TA&F Benefits." What pops here for you? What jumps out at you? So they're dividing the TANF benefit as a percentage of the federal poverty line. They're dividing it into 4 categories. States that pay 11 to 19%, states that pay 20 to 29%, states that pay 30 to 39%, states that pay 40 to 60%. Okay? So anything jump out at you? Just looking at the map. Right? This is probably the part that's going to jump out for most people, right? That the southern states, the old South, typically pay less than 30%. In fact, most of them pay less than 20%. And there are a couple of states like Indiana and Idaho here that are also falling into that group, kind of outliers. Okay. And then the states up here typically pay over 30%, and a couple of states here that pay over 40% of the federal poverty level. So if you were to overlay this map with the map of the dominant culture type, they would look pretty similar, right? Look at this. This shows that in Texas, from over a 1-year period from July of 2020 to July of 2021, the benefit only increased by $5, which that's not even close to keeping up with inflation, right? All right, then this table, I put this together based on that 2013 data, but again, it hasn't really changed much. Where I also include, I divided the range. Again, we have a low of 10% of Mississippi to a high of 48.5% of New York. I just took that range and divided it into thirds, high, medium, and low. Okay, so that low is defined as 0 to 19%, medium is defined as 20 to 29%, and high is defined as 30 to 50%. Okay, and then also included the culture type in here. And again, I think you can kind of just eyeball it and see that there's a pattern there. But if we wanted to be a little bit more precise about it, we could actually do a crosstab. Just set up a table here where we have the culture types defining the rows, and then the level of benefits defining the columns. So what this is telling us, I know you can read a table, but let me just kind of walk you through it. Of the 17 states that LSR says have a dominant traditionalistic culture, 13 pay a low level of benefits. Or if you want to think about it in relative frequency, over 3/4 of the traditionalistic states, 76%, almost 77% of the traditionalistic states pay a low level of benefits. And then the remaining pay medium. So low and medium, 100%. Here, the moralistic states, you have 17 moralistic states, 10 pay a high level of benefits, and only 1 a low level of benefits. But again, if you want to look at the relative frequency, you see that it's almost 60%. Okay? So just looking at the table, you can kind of see that there's some evidence to support that there's what's going on here when the states control these programs is that the prevailing cultural attitudes seem to have a significant influence on the elements of the program. Does that make sense? You can also do a little simple statistic, compute a simple statistic, and don't worry, you don't have to copy this down or worry about this for the purposes of the exam or anything, but some of you may have a background in statistics, or you're going to take some statistics courses, and you'll be introduced to what the statisticians refer to as a PRE statistic, a proportional reduction in error statistic. But in this case, it's called a gamma, and it ranges from a value of negative 1.0 to positive 1.0. So it looks something like this, like where 0 is here, okay? And the first thing that we look at is the sign, okay? If it's a negative sign, it suggests a lack of support for the hypothesis. The hypothesis here, by the way, is that there's some relationship between culture and the level of benefits, so that moralistic states are more likely to pay a high level of benefits and traditionalistic are more likely to pay a low level of benefits, with the individualistic states being in between. We said we kind of saw that looking at the crosstab, right? Okay, but what this statistic tells us is that if it's a positive, then that's suggesting that the relationship that you're seeing in the data actually is consistent with the hypothesis. Now, what does 0.78 suggest? Or I tell you what, let's start here on the positive side. As we move in this direction towards 1.0, what's it suggesting about the strength of the relationship? The closer you get to 1.A, the stronger that relationship is, right? If we had found, for example, that all the moralistic states pay high and all the traditionalistic states pay low and all of the individualistic states pay in the medium range, we would have calculated the statistic, it would have been a 1.0, okay? But it's not a perfect association, right? But 0.78 is pretty strong. In social science research, trust me, you start getting up around 7, 8, 0.7, 0.8, you're talking about a pretty strong relationship. There does really seem to be something going on here between these two phenomena, cultural attitudes about welfare policy and the actual elements of the program itself, okay, which makes a lot of intuitive sense. Of course, if the states have the authority to determine the level of benefits, they're going to set it at a level that's consistent with their views on how welfare should work, right? How public assistance should work. It's like in Texas, we kind of have this idea that the last thing you want to do when it comes to providing public assistance to people is provide them with too much money, right? Because if you provide them with too much money, they'll become dependent upon it. And why would they then go out and get a job and provide for themselves? You hear those kind of arguments all the time in Texas, right? Okay, we're out of time. We will see you in, what was it, Thursday? Or is it a week from today? What did I tell you? I already forgot. It's a week from Thursday for you guys? Okay. See you in 8 days, something like that. 9 days.